Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so happy and glad to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to speak to you and tell you a little bit about Austria and the European Union. My gratitude also goes to Tom for inviting me here and giving me a chance, and also for the kind words of introduction by Ambassador Chris Ho, who, as he pointed out, we got to know each other in Vienna before my leaving for the United States. Well, as Chris mentioned, I was an assistant professor at social and economic history at the University of Graz, so therefore everything I'm talking about is usually influenced a little bit by historical facts and historical events. So I hope I'm not going to bore you too much with what I will be saying, but it will also come to more recent events and issues that pertain to Austria and the European Union. However, what I would like to start with is that it was more than a century ago, this June, exactly 101 years, that an Austrian pacifist with the name of Bertha von Suttner died in Vienna. The world at that time was just weeks away from what would later be called the Great War. When Bertha von Suttner passed away at the age of 71 on June the 21st, 1914, the shots in Sarajevo had not yet been fired, and the world certainly did not expect to find itself in the midst of intense fighting within less than 2 months. At least Bertha von Suttner was lucky enough not to see the catastrophe she had been manifested against for decades to happen. Having worked for Alfred Nobel at a young age, she had always championed the ideas of peace and demilitarization. In 1905, she was the first Austrian and the first woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. More than 100 years later, in 2012, an international organization which at that time had been in existence for just 60 years also received the Nobel Peace Prize. And as you surely know, this organization was the European Union, which was conceived and set up in response to the horrors of another major conflict that shook Europe and the world within less than 30 years. The European continent, ravaged by war. I think we'll get our dessert.
This is part one of the Kaiserschmarren. Well, more
wow.
to come. It's in the oven, okay? So as it runs out, don't be disturbed.
Thank you. The European continent, ravaged by war and politically divided by ideological competition between the then two world-leading powers, the US and the Soviet Union, needed to rebuild itself. After millions had been killed and cities and infrastructure had been destroyed, European politicians eventually realized that hatred, revenge, and nationalism, factors that had influenced European politics for decades, were maybe not the best pillars upon which to base the new Europe. In May of 1950, a year after NATO was founded, the then French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed to create a new community which would put the coal and steel industry of 6 European states under a common high authority. The European Coal and Steel Community was established in 1951, and in 1957 the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community were created. In 1967, the three institutions merged to become the European Communities, or EC, as the European Union was called up until 1993. While West Germany was quickly reintegrated into Western Europe, as I said, European Communities, NATO, Austria had to go it alone, and as Chris pointed out, Austria was occupied by the 4 Allied powers, similar to Germany after World War II. Even the capital city of Vienna was divided into different sectors. But there was one area that was jointly administered by all 4 powers, the downtown district. And it was at that time that when the Cold War had already started, that the four in the Jeep were still patrolling jointly the downtown area of the capital, Vienna. The time after 45 was not an easy one for Austria. But luckily, the US had decided to launch the European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan, to assist Europe in rebuilding itself. Even though scholars disagree on how much was exactly given under the Marshall Plan, there is no doubt that Austria, which had been hit hard by the war and was located along the border of East and West, benefited above average from the generous support by the United States. Austria was, in fact, the only country occupied, at least partly, by Soviet troops that got funds under the Marshall Plan. While Austria's economy slowly but steadily grew, there was hardly any movement on the political track. It took the death of Stalin in March of 1953 that the drive for regaining complete independence got steam. In order to prevent Austria from joining NATO and to drive a wedge between the northern and southern parts of NATO, the Soviet Union insisted on Austria becoming a military neutral country. On October the 22nd, 1955, this day later on became the Austrian National Day, it still is the Austrian National Day, the Austrian Parliament passed a constitutional amendment, the so-called Neutrality Act, which declared the country permanently neutral. Austria would never join a military alliance, nor would it allow foreign troops on its territory. As a small state squeezed between the East and the West, it was possibly the best solution available to Austria at the time. However, at the same time, Austria was fully committed to the Western values of democracy and freedom. Austria at that time thought that the best policy for it to be was to actively engage other countries. And in 1961 and in 1978, we had highest ranking visits by the two superpowers taking place in Vienna. One was Khrushchev and Kennedy in 61, and then Kartner and Brezhnev in 78. Austria also, right from the beginning, took part in peacekeeping operations by the United Nations. We sent people to the Congo, to Cyprus, to Egypt, and later on to the Balkans. The idea behind a strong engagement in multilateral fora was the belief that the more you engage in these institutions and the more you contribute to a peaceful resolution of conflict, the more indispensable you and the good offices you provide become, and the less likely you are to end up to being a victim of aggression. And I assume that it was the example of Switzerland, which had been spared fighting and occupation during both world wars, maybe was behind that idea. While Austria was pursuing an active foreign policy, the European Union, at that time still called the European Communities, only slowly began its first steps toward a common foreign political policy. In 1970, the European Political Cooperation created an informal consultation mechanism which aimed at coordinating national foreign policies. But the EBC only had a mixed success, as it was based on the voluntary willingness of the states involved to cooperate. Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State in the 1970s, famously once remarked, and I think you all know that, "Whom do I call if I want to call Europe?" The weakness of the European political coordination mechanism became apparent after the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, and particularly during the Yugoslav wars in the early 1990s. The end of the Cold War, the lifting of the Iron Curtain, the bringing down of communist rule in Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany, and the demise of the Soviet Union were international game changers, and as such had a profound impact on both the European Union and Austria. In 1992, the European Union was formally established. It got a three-pillar system, which is no longer in place, because it was actually superseded by the mechanism that were put in place by the Treaty of Lisbon. And it tried to come up with a more coherent approach to different areas of policies, among them foreign policy. To that extent, the new post of High Representative for the Common Security and Foreign Policy was created to give the EU foreign policy a higher profile and to make it more coherent and visible. The next step forward came, as I just mentioned, came with the Treaty of Lisbon, which went into effect in 2009. And it brought also about the so-called European External Action Service, a kind of European foreign service, which currently employs about 7,000 people worldwide and in head office in Brussels. But just to point it out as well, it's a small service. I mean, if you think about the European Union, it's a union of more than 500 million people, but the Foreign Service numbers only 7,000. The German Foreign Service has over 11,000 people personnel. The French employs over 15,000. And these are nations: Germany 80 million people, France approximately 63, 64 million. So just for reasons of comparison. Even though the EU foreign policy got strengthened by the Lisbon Treaty, most areas of foreign policy still require unanimity. It is mainly the area of foreign economic policy, particularly trade relations, that is unified in the sense that it is in general the EU Commission which acts and speaks on behalf of all member states. But even here, and I think many might recall the current negotiations about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the Commission first needed a mandate by all the member states before it was able to start negotiations with the United States. Austria had already intended to apply for EU or EC membership in the 1970s, but due to Soviet resistance, Austria could only submit its application in July of 1989, when the Cold War was more or less coming to its end. Quickly after Austria, also Finland, Sweden and Norway submitted their applications. One of the ideas was joining the EU. The idea was that the internal market within the European Union got more and more integrated, and it was more and more difficult for companies located outside the European Union or the EC to do business. So, for example, Swedish Volvo or the largest Austrian steelmaker first were not too happy about not being able to export their products into the European Union. So one main reason behind joining the EU, not just for political reasons, but also was particularly economic reasons. Austria joined in 1995. What did it change? What was the difference between before and thereafter? I don't want to talk too much about the EU itself. I assume that many of you know how the EU works, or at least have heard about it, how it works, or it's supposed to work. I mean, sometimes it does it better, sometimes maybe not as good as it could. But there are many different institutions, but I think, the same might be true here for the US. You have Congress, you have the ministries, you have the various agencies. It's more or less the same with the European Union. The only difference is that in the EU, the legislative branch